Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Michael Coffman. I'm a research scientist, have my PhD in environmental sciences, and have been doing research for over 30 years in that particular field. It was about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, I began to realize exactly what was going on with the environmental movement. In fact, I was leading a multi-million-dollar research effort on the effects of acid rain and global climate change when I began to realize that the environmental community, both nationally and internationally, was not really interested in protecting the environment, contrary to what most of you believe, but in advancing an agenda to control the world. That's no overstatement. It is literally happening right now. I wish we could spend 2 or 3 hours talking about it, but obviously we don't have the time for that. As a consequence, I want to focus on just 3 primary areas of prophecy, because not only was I a research scientist, but I was a student of prophecy. I even developed an 11-week course in which we just finished one segment of it for the whole community, the community that I live in, where we look at the prophetic events in Daniel, Revelation, New Testament, Old Testament in detail to look at exactly what might be coming, what has happened already and what might be coming yet in the future. As a result of that, I have a fairly good background in what is happening prophetically today. And as I mentioned momentarily ago, I want to focus on just 3 areas. I can't possibly cover everything that I covered over an 11-week period. But I want to just take 3 major prophecies that we have. I think most people are interested, even non-Christians are interested. One is the so-called one world government and one world religion. Another is the 10-nation confederacy, the 10 horns of Daniel and Revelation. And the third, out of Revelation chapter 13, is the mark of the beast. The mark, or 666, that has always had the world so enthralled. Now, many generations, all through since the time of Christ, have believed that they're the generation in which Christ was going to return. However, he has obviously not returned. And I have to ask myself, is this one of those times? Do we see certain signs that seem to be the fulfillment of prophecy and Christ is going to return right now? Well, I have to believe that it's imminent, because never in the history since Christianity was born has there been so many prophecies concerning the end times being fulfilled right in front of our eyes. Does that mean it's going to happen tomorrow or next week or next year? I have no idea, because Jesus Christ said that we will never know. But he said to look at the signs of the times. And as the fig tree begins to bloom, realize that the time is near. And I believe we're in that time. It may be another 20 or 30 years. I don't know. But so much has happened in the last 10 to 15 years that it's hard for me to imagine it's going to take another 30 years to happen. Okay, so let's go to Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2 is, as many of you recognize, the chapter in which Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. Now, Daniel, if you recall, has been sent into exile. He's been chosen to be a sorcerer, a prophet for the king, Nebuchadnezzar. And he is thrown in with this group of men that were supposed to advise Nebuchadnezzar as to what he should do and what he should not do. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. He dreamt something that was very, very intriguing, but he just didn't understand what it meant. So he called his sorcerers to him. Daniel was not included. He was away at the time. And he asked the sorcerers not only what the dream meant, but he asked them to define what the dream was without telling them. Now, that's quite a feat. And when they could not tell him what he had dreamt, he said, unless you can do that, you are all going to be killed. I'm going to kill you because you're obviously not a true sorcerer. And as a consequence of that, he set out the edict that all of these sorcerers and magicians and astrologers and so forth should be put to the sword unless they tell him what he dreamt and then interpreted what he dreamt to what it really means. And as a result of that, as Daniel came back and he found out about this, he was one of the sorcerers that would be killed. And he and his other friends began to pray. And he finally went to the king and he said, "O king, let me be praying about this for a moment and see what God tells me." So the king said, okay. He went back overnight and he had a dream from God of exactly what it was that Nebuchadnezzar had dreamt. And not only did he dream what Nebuchadnezzar had dreamt, but he also dreamt exactly what it meant. And so he went back to Nebuchadnezzar the next morning and he said, O king, I have this prophecy or this message from you. And then he describes the dream. And then eventually the actual interpretation. And this is what it was. In verse 31 and 35, you looked, O king, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in its appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. This is what Daniel saw, in essence, an artist's rendition of it, a golden head, which Daniel then said was Nebuchadnezzar. The next was a silver chest and 2 arms, which turned out to be, in fact, in Daniel chapter 8, it mentions the fact that it is Media and Persia. So the kingdom of Persia and the kingdom of Media combined to form one massive kingdom, and that's what the silver chest represented. Then the third one was Alexander the Great, the thighs of bronze. Alexander the Great came across all of the known world about that time in astonishing speed, literally defeating the Persian Empire, crumbling before his advance. And then finally, the Roman Empire, one of the longest-lived empires in human history. But it's interesting that if you look at the Roman Empire, the two legs representing one Rome and 2 Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire, because they actually split at the end and made 2, just like the 2 arms of medieval Persia. But there was something else that was very interesting. In verse 40, he goes on to say, finally, there will be a 4th kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Rome was extremely strong. Again, it conquered all the known world except for the far eastern world. At the time, it was one of the strongest empires the world has ever known. But at the same time, in verse 41, it says, just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom, yet it will have some of its strength of iron in it. And as the Roman Empire began to crumble within itself, it began to conquer the northern tribes of Germany and so forth, intermixed with that, and became weaker and weaker and weaker, much like the feet of clay and iron. It was not strong, and yet it was very strong at the same time. Eventually, Rome was conquered by the Germans from within. So it fractured from within, much like you would expect a feet made of iron and clay mixed together. In verse 42, it says, as the toes were partially of iron and partially of clay, so this kingdom will be partially strong and partially brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. Again, we have a representation of 10 toes. So at the end of time, before Christ returns, there will be 10 kingdoms. This will be divided into 10 kingdoms. And they will be made up of a mixture of clay and iron, just like the legs. They will be exceedingly strong, but at the same time very brittle and will not remain united. Now let's just take a look at the background of what is happening today. Although most people fully do not recognize it, do not realize it, there are 5 global power factions operating in the world today. There are many more, of course, but there are 5 major ones that we are aware of in the evening news, even though they're never described that way. Well, first of all, we have the Anglo-American faction. That is the faction of the banking cartel of Great Britain and the United States, or America. They basically control what is happening, or at least heavily influence what is happening in world events today. It's amazing how many people totally really don't understand why Great Britain always stands at her side, but nobody else does. Well, it's because of the banking cartel. The central banks, the U.S. Federal Reserve and the Bank of England, basically control 1/2 of the monetary flow every day of every year. It is exceedingly powerful. they have tremendous, tremendous influence, almost control of the United States government. Again, most people don't realize that, and if you mention this in public, you're going to be accused of some sort of conspiracist. But it's a fact, and I'll get to that in a moment. The next is the Socialist European faction, made up of most of Europe. This group is highly socialistic. They are competing with the Anglo-American faction in a way in which they hope to predominate in the emerging one world government. They want to be on top, and they are doing all that they can to stop the Anglo-American faction in whatever they do. That's one of the reasons that you see France and Germany primarily opposing us on so many of the international issues, because they are the leaders of the European Socialist group, and they are the ones that are trying to undermine the United States and Great Britain at every turn. Most people are not aware of this, although they have seen it in the issues of Iraq, when they've not supported us in Iraq. France has actually formed an allegiance with Saddam Hussein, financial allegiance and so forth, and as a consequence are doing things in which they are trying to undermine the United States of America. The Russian faction is another. The Russian Federation is a united group of leftover of the Soviet Union that is grouping now to form a union not unlike the European Union, in which they will be an economic competitor with the rest of the world. They've got a long ways to go, but they are trying to do everything they can to undermine the Anglo-American faction and have actually joined forces with the Socialist Europeans on many, many cases. The Chinese faction is yet another one. The Chinese faction acts more like a spoiler in many events, trying to gain world dominance. That is their goal. They want to be on top when this world government emerges as the masters. They've got a long ways to go. It's not likely they can do that because they're so fractured. Their economy is teetering on disaster right now with the banking problems that they have. But nonetheless, they are trying everything they can do to undermine the Anglo-American faction. The Islam faction is a fifth one. They are the ones that came roaring onto the scenes on September 11th, 2001. They've actually been around much longer than that, but most people were totally unaware of them until September 11th, or 9/11 as we call it. Most people are unaware that the Saudi families have been supporting these kinds of terrorists for many, many years. In fact, they have to be, in the tunes of billions of dollars. Most people have no concept that the Saudis, the very rich Saudis and other rich Arab nations are doing all they can to support these terrorists to undermine the United States, Great Britain, and Europe. It's an amazing thing. Now, not everyone is doing that, understand, but yet these people, these terrorists have to get their money from somewhere, and it's coming from the coffers of these oil-rich nations. Primarily, again, to design and destabilize the Western world. And I want to refer to a book written by historian Carroll Quigley back in 1966. Carroll Quigley was one of the foremost historians of the 20th century. His record, his credentials are impeccable, and as a consequence, he is an excellent source. And he describes all the international intrigue and so forth going on for the past 60 to 80 years prior to that. On page 950, for instance, he says this: "There does exist an international Anglophile network which operates to some extent in the way the radical right believes the communists act. In fact, this network, which we may identify as the roundtable groups, has no aversion to cooperating with the communists or any other groups, and frequently does so." So we have here an admission on his part that there is a group out there that acts pretty much like the communists do. In fact, they actually supported the communists for the 72 years that they were in existence. And as a result of this, they are both working within the United States and without the United States to create tension in the world in which they can then thrive and operate. He goes on to say on the same page, "I know of the operations of this network because I have studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s to examine its papers and secret records." So he's in the know. He's actually done the research. You can't question what he's saying unless he's outright lying. He goes on to say, "I have no aversion to it are to most of its aims, and have, for much of my life, been close to it and so many of its instruments. In other words, what he is saying is he's studied it in depth, he's been allowed to look at the records, he knows what he's talking about, and he agrees with it. And yet, he comes out with this book actually spelling out exactly what's going on. On page 324, he goes on to say, the powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalistic fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements. In other words, there is an agenda out there to control the world, and the head of it are these banks. And the other power factions of the world are vying to destabilize that and carve out a niche for themselves, if not come on top of the pile. Hence, the clay mixed with iron. It will never be a fully stable government, even though it is all powerful, because you have internal parties that are vying for power. It's as simple as that. Goes on to say the apex of the system was to be in the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world central banks, which were themselves private corporations. So it's all controlled out of the Bank of International Settlements. And remember, I just told you that the Federal Reserve, the United States Federal Reserve, and the Bank of England control at least 1/2 of the actual monetary flow in the world each day. So those two dominate. In fact, it's the Federal Reserve that dominates the most. Even though they don't control the most cash flow, they still dominate, probably in most respects, the rest of the central banks of the world. Also, there have been a number, and I'm not going to have time to get into them. I do have other videos that you can watch to see how this happens. But they also have had numerous meetings through the United Nations to centralize more and more and more and more control in the Bank of International Settlements. How does this come about? I don't have time to go through everything, but remember that all through the Old Testament, there were numerous examples of pantheistic religions, Baalism and so forth, that dominated that particular culture. There were hundreds and hundreds of these, but they all have had one thing in common, and that is pantheism. Basically bringing together Western mysticism and Eastern mysticism in what is called Freemasonry. Most Masons have no idea that their organization is involved in the occult, basically being derived from theosophy. I'm going to be talking about theosophy in a minute. Suffice it to say right now that Freemasonry has been the vehicle by which this has been transmitted throughout the world. Now again, I would say probably 99% of the Freemasons have no idea that this is happening. And that's one of the problems you get into when you actually belong to a secret organization, is that there is information withheld from you as you go from one level to another level to another level until you finally reach the enlightened stage. Now how does this happen? Let's go on. In The Secret Doctrine, which was written by Madame Helena Blavatsky, lays out this New Age concept. It's the New Age Bible in many respects. And she goes on to state that every dogmatic religion, preeminently the Christian, points out that Satan is the enemy of God. Now, there's no question, if you look at the Bible, that this is what the Bible says, that Satan is the arch enemy. Now listen to what she says. In reality, Satan is the highest divine spirit, the occult wisdom on earth. In other words, she's basically saying that Satan is truly God, the God of light. Thus, the Christian church is intolerant, bigoted, and cruel to all who do not choose to believe it as slaves. Both these churches, Catholic and Protestant, are fighting against the divine truth. She basically says that Satan has the truth, not God as revealed through the Bible. When repudiating and slandering the dragon of esoteric wisdom, i.e. Satan, they, the Christian churches, are moved by the spirit of dark fanaticism. Now we're going to see in a moment how this is being translated into geopolitics. In fact, Hitler himself in Germany in World War II was a devout student of Blavatsky. And it was through her works, her writings, that he decided that the Jews had to be obliterated in order to usher in his millennium kingdom. And as a consequence, what he has looked at in many respects is the fact that what happened in World War II to the Jews can be directly linked right back to Helena Blavatsky and the secret doctrine. Another student of Blavatsky was Alice Bailey, who began her work in the early 1900s and extended it through the first half of the 20th century. She wrote, I think, either 24 or 26 books, revealing what she believes to be what is known as the plan. We're going to talk about the plan in a moment. But the plan is implementing this religious belief across the entire world as a world religion. What she says on page 511 and 13 is that the Masonic movement will meet the needs of those who can and should wield power. It is the custodian of the law. It is the home of the mysteries and the seat of initiation. It is a far more occult organization that can be realized and is intended to be the training school for the coming advanced occultists. In its ceremonies lies hid the wielding of the forces connected with the growth and life of the kingdoms of nature and the unfoldment of the divine aspects of man. Now notice how she relates or brings together the kingdoms of nature and the divine aspects of man. This has been the case right since the days of Nimrod, where Nimrod believed that human beings could become God and were involved in all things of nature. Going on, in the comprehension of symbolism, there will come the power to cooperate with the divine plan. The divine plan is to usher mankind into godhood. There is no disassociation between the one universal church, the sacred inner lodge of all true Masons, and the innermost circles of esoteric societies. So she links Freemasons, the occult religion, and the desire to create man into godhood, which is coming with the age of Aquarius. Manly Hall was a 33rd degree Mason and a historian of the Masonic movement. And he goes on to say, yet if the so-called secrets of Freemasonry should be shouted from the housetops, the fraternity would be absolutely safe, for certain spiritual qualities are necessary before the real Masonic secrets can be understood by the brethren themselves. In other words, the Masons, as they go through the various initiations, have no understanding of what it really means until they reach the final level, which is the 33rd level, even though all through this time they believe there's only 32 levels, and most of them, 99% of them, never make it past the 32nd degree. And as a consequence, very few Masons really understand the true meaning of Masonry. It goes on to say, hence the alleged exposures of Freemasonry that has been printed by the thousands and the tens of thousands since the 1730s down to the present hour cannot injure the fraternity. They reveal merely the outward forms and the ceremonies of Freemasonry. Only those who have been weighed in the balance and found to be true, upright, and square have prepared themselves by their own growth to appreciate the inner meanings of their craft. What he's saying is that only those who reach the absolute top really begin to comprehend the true occult basis and foundation of Freemasonry. Now, Masons throughout the world have done a lot of very positive things, and they're good. I'm not trying to deny that, but they're all still smoke screens of what is really happening. Foster Bailey, the husband of Alice Bailey, also a 33rd degree Mason, in the book Spirit of Masonry, says, stage by stage, they, the spirits, we would call them demons, assist in the unfolding of the consciousness of the candidate until the time comes when he can enter into the light, which is Satan, and in his turn become a light bearer, one of the Illuminati. You've heard that expression before. It's a real thing I'll be talking about in a moment. Who can assist the lodge on high in bringing humanity into light. It stands proven that Satan, or the red fiery dragon, the Lord of Phosphorus, and Lucifer, the light bearer, is in us. It is in our mind. Our tempter and redeemer, our intelligent liberator and savior. So now we're seeing Satan cast in the form not only of the angel of light, but also a savior, as Christ is a savior. This is what they believe in. They have a right to believe what they want to, but at the same time, it's diametrically opposed to Christianity. And many, many pastors across this country are directly involved in Masonry, and when they're told that it's involved in the occult, they will adamantly deny it. And yet here you have, I have a lot more evidence I don't have time to explain right now, but a lot of evidence exists that it not only does exist, not only are the Masons involved in cult, but they are the driving force behind the world government and the world religion. Now let's go on to something a little bit different. I want to show you how geopolitically this is made manifest in what is happening today in the world. In the 1990s, an international treaty called the Convention on Biological Diversity was introduced in the U.S. Senate to be ratified. It was stopped. I'm not going to talk about that. I have many other videos that describe exactly how we did that. But at the same time, it had a foundational document in which was to be written into the implementing language of the treaty once the United States Senate had ratified it. This was not known to the Senate. We got a copy to the Senate the day they were to ratify it, and that's how we stopped it, because they saw exactly what was intended. The United Nations, when we attempted to get this document, and the Senate attempted to get this document, denied it even existed. They did not want the United States Senate to see it before they voted on the treaty. In section 12.2.3 on page 838, it says, "The Western worldview is characteristic of large-scale societies, heavily dependent on resources brought in from considerable distances. It is a worldview that is characterized by the denial of the sacred attributes of nature, which became firmly established about 2,000 years ago with the Judeo-Christian Islamic religious traditions." In other words, there you have it. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, the monotheistic belief systems of the world, are responsible for all the ecological catastrophe that they see is happening in the world today. It's as simple as that. Christianity is the one to blame. Going on, for most of human existence, traditional societies lived by an ethical paradigm in which nature is valued for both in its own right and for its role in spirituality. Traditional societies have considered certain sites as sacred, where most human activities are prohibited. Most societies have also considered certain species as sacred. Notice that they lay out the two contrasts. One is pantheism and the other one is Christianity or monotheism. Monotheism is responsible for all the disasters. Traditional societies or pantheism is noted for its wonderful relationship to Mother Earth, our God, what they believe is God. And to do that, right in this United Nations document, they said that most human activities must be prohibited. They want to set aside, I'm not going to have time to go into this, again I have other videos that do this in detail. They wanted to set aside 1/2 of the world and America into wilderness in order to meet this goal. This is what the Convention on Biological Diversity was designed to do. It's amazing. Here it is, their belief system being manifest in international law. Going on, traditional or pantheistic societies tend to view themselves as members of a community that not only includes others, humans, but also plants and animals, as well as rocks, springs, and pools. So understand, their belief system literally looks at nature, even rocks and pools or lakes, springs, as part of a member of your community. Why? Because many of them believe in reincarnation, and at one time their ancestors were a rock. Now that's extreme, I know, but understand, when they look at the whole concept of evolution, that word can be transposed as reincarnation as well. And therefore everything about Earth has equal value, and therefore we must protect all things of Earth, even at the expense of humanity. It goes on to say that people are members of a community of beings, living and non-living. Don't be fooled by the fact that because you have rocks out there is not a member of your community. Even though it is not living as we understand it, it still has equal rights to you and I. Thus, rivers may be viewed as mothers and animals may be treated as kin. But many restraints on the use of natural resources, including the protection of sacred sites, may have evolved culturally in response to the need to ensure more sustainable use of biological populations and the conservation of biological diversity. Now, isn't that amazing? That these ancient societies, living back to thousands of years ago, somehow knew they had to conserve biological diversity, and therefore they had these protected areas, sacred sites, and so forth, in order to protect biological diversity. Compliance in such societies is typically assured through two devices: the fear of the offended nature spirits and the social sanctions against offenders. What you're seeing here is the redevelopment of environmentalism into a religion. It's deliberate. And much of the stuff that you see coming out of in the media, we do have environmental problems, don't get me wrong. But at the same time, most of what you see coming out of the media is nothing more than propaganda to indoctrinate us into this new religion. I'll show you in just a moment. Finally, societies dominated by Islam, and especially Christianity, have gone furthest in setting humans apart from nature and embracing a new value system that has converted the world into a warehouse of commodities for human enjoyment, and in the process, nature has lost its sacred qualities. So once again, you're beginning to see what Madame Helena Blavatsky said in her Secret Doctrine, is that Christianity is the problem, the root problem. Judaism and Islam have to be dealt with in order to bring in this new age of Aquarius, because nature has lost its sacred qualities. They have been doing this through what is known as the Earth Charter. The Earth Charter has been being developed for the last 30 years or so. It saw its first appearance at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, but it was so pantheistic that it could not be accepted. When you begin to say that the Earth is a living entity, that goes a little too far for even most nations to ascribe to. So they sent it back to committee, as it were, through a guy by the name of Maurice Strong, who was a very occult multi-millionaire, and Mikhail Gorbachev, to rewrite this and to sanitize it, to make it more palatable to the world. And it came out early in the 21st century. And it goes on to say that the Earth Charter, this is not the Earth Charter itself, but the description of the Earth Charter that was on his website in 1997. The Earth Charter is the articulation of a spiritual vision that reflects the universal spiritual values whose objective is to implement a radical change in humans' attitudes and values. When they say radical, they mean radical because it literally means turning our Western beliefs on their head and going back to this nature worship that they want to get us to. It is a people's charter that serves a universal code of conduct. So in other words, everybody has to do it, for ordinary citizens, educators, business executives, scientists, and even religious leaders. So there will be a time in the near future, I'm not sure when, in which Christianity, as historically known, biblical Christianity, will not be able to stay above ground. It will have to go underground, much like it was in the first 2 centuries of the Roman Empire. It's going to be that serious, because Christianity has to ascribe to this new pantheistic worldview if it's to survive as a church above the ground, where people can see it every day. This Earth Charter was brought to the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg, South Africa in August and September of 2002. They wanted to basically get the sanctification, or get the approval of the United Nations to put this in as a world ethics system, is what they called it, but it really wasn't a world religion. They brought in what they call the Ark of Hope. The Ark of Hope is a knockoff of the Ark of the Covenant, and it has a tremendous number of occult symbolisms all over it. I'll talk about a couple of them. On the end cap of the Ark of Hope, you have this menagerie of animals stacked up pretty much in the shape of a pyramid, because a pyramid is a very, very dramatic occult symbol. And what we're seeing right here, the 2 crocodiles, are the wise ones. They're the guardians in this occult symbology. The owl at the very top is an owl of wisdom, and she's a goddess in occult linguistics. Then you have the triangle itself, which makes up the Lord Buddha, the Master Dual Kal. Alice Bailey said, wrote all of her books. Dual Kal is an ascended master, according to what she says, and is the writer of her 26 books. We call him a demon. The final leg of this triangle is the avatar of synthesis, which brings everything together in what's called the Son of God. Not the S-O-N of God, but the S-U-N of God, being the source of life. You also have on the front of the Ark of Hope this symbology again of animals, but they're in a circle. And you can see the circle, and the circle of life is the reincarnation concept that is so prevalent within most pantheistic societies. And what we have here is literally the manifestation of the circle of life in which we, as we reincarnate into one level into another, gradually ascend into humanity as well, and eventually into being an ascended master according to their theology. Finally, the Earth Charter itself was brought to the United Nations, and it starts out like this. We stand at a critical moment in Earth's history, a time when humanity must choose its future. There's no option. We have to choose which way we're going. It goes on to say, humanity is part of a vast evolving universe. Earth, our home, is alive with a unique community of life. Notice how they have softened this, that the earth is alive, to one in which the earth is alive with a unique community of life. It's still there. The pantheistic undertones are still there, except an unknowledgeable person probably would not understand that this truly is pantheism. It was brought to the United Nations on the World Summit on Sustainable Development in September of 2002, and was brought up for acceptance into the United Nations as the United Nations doctrine. But you know what? God is in control. And this is the one thing that we can be sure of. In Psalms 2, 1 through 6, it says, "Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers gather together against the Lord and against his anointed one. Let us break their chains," they say, "and throw off their fetters." This is exactly what they're trying to do, is to shove God off into the corner and make Satan their king. The one enthroned in heaven laughs, and the Lord scoffs at them. Then he rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath. There will be a day when the Lord will take vengeance on these people. God is in control, and he's not going to allow anything to happen until it's in his time frame for it to happen. That's why I think he used the 3 or 4 of us to stop the Convention on Biological Diversity from being ratified in the U.S. Senate, because it was not yet time for that to happen. What happened was that the summit failed. At the very last moment, there were several hundred of us talking with the State Department representatives, convincing them that this Earth Charter was very, very dangerous and had to be stopped at any cost. And the United States was able to get the language pulled from the final consensus document just a few hours before it was finally printed and given to the delegates. It came that close, but yet God is faithful. It did not happen. If it had happened, they would have been bringing out immediately the draft of the International Covenant on Environment and Development. And this is a treaty, much like the Convention on Biological Diversity, that puts into teeth, legally, everything that's within the Earth Charter. The Earth Charter itself does not force a nation to do anything. But at the same time, this International Covenant on Environment and Development does. It would force us, literally, in every aspect of our lives, to conform to their pantheistic vision of what government ought to be and how you and I should behave. It would result in a radical, radical, radical change of our lifestyles, because we would no longer have the lifestyles that we have right now, because we're not sustainable. Literally not sustainable. There's nothing about our society that's sustainable. We would have to go back another 100 years, probably eliminate 2/3 of the Earth's population to become sustainable according to their vision of things. And we're seeing this literally being brought to fruition in major media throughout the United States, both in television, printed form, global warming, ozone depletion, you name it. It's called the greening of America and the world. It's a new religion, and we're buying into it whole cloth, even many of our denominations. Again, does that mean that we shouldn't protect the environment? Not at all. We should. We have a stewardship responsibility. But the fact is that most of what you're seeing on television and the news is nothing but a hoax. And I wish I would be able to talk to you a little bit more in detail about some of those things, but unfortunately, right now, we just don't have the time. I do have many videos and books and so forth on this very subject if you want to take advantage of them. So let's go back to the Freemasonry theosophy, Eastern and Western mysticism and concept, and see what happened. It took its form in the Illuminati. Again, this is another conspiracy concept, but it has its roots in historical fact. It probably doesn't exist as Illuminati anymore. It's evolved into many other things, but the fact is it did exist. As we heard Carroll Quigley talk about in his book, Tragedy and Hope, it's all now being basically controlled by what is known as the Round Tables that was created by Cecil Rhodes. They developed what is known as the Council on Foreign Relations. You've heard them in the news almost every week. They're a very dynamic organization. And what we're seeing in this dynamic organization is the literal fulfillment of Cecil Rhodes' concept of world domination. He wanted to draw all power to the British Isles, or to Great Britain. Well, it's expanded now to Great Britain and the United States, but the fact is that we have a situation through the Council on Foreign Relations whose their whole purpose is to create a world government. Now, saying that, realize that most members of the Council on Foreign Relations, or the CFR as they're popularly known, have no idea that they are involved in this kind of an organization. They're there because of prestige, they're there because they believe it's helpful to their political advancement, they're there for any number of reasons, but the fact is the CFR is a front for the Round Tables. At the same time, in Great Britain is the Institute of International Affairs. They're doing the same thing in Great Britain. The Bilderbergers are yet another, and the Club of Rome another. The Club of Rome is a very, very occult organization. And then finally, created by David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski, the Trilateral Commission back in 1973. These are all fronts. Now from these fronts, hundreds and hundreds of more organizations have been created, making it so diffuse that no one really knows who belongs to what. And I believe that was deliberate, because what they found was that in the process, if you have a single organization called the Illuminati, which was in existence, it's too easy a target. The Freemasons were being accused of too many things, and as a consequence, all of these things, they split off into these many myriads of organizations, led primarily by the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, the Bilderbergers, Trilateral Commission, the Club of Rome, the Institute of International Affairs. But there are a lot more. Now, they don't work in lockstep, and it would be a mistake to think that they do. They basically work together towards a common goal, and power figures come and go during this whole time. But nonetheless, they're all working towards a world government, and with some of them working towards a world religion as well. Let's go back to 1974 in a Foreign Affairs article, because Foreign Affairs is the quarterly publication of the CFR, or the Council on Foreign Relations. If you see an article expounding something new within the Foreign Affairs, know that it's either a trial balloon, they're floating it to see how well it's accepted, or it's going to be policy within the next 2 to 3 years of the United States. It's that clear cut. And this is what he says. Richard Gardner, who was one of the co-founders of the Trilateral Commission, writing in Foreign Affairs in 1974, he says, in short, the house of world order would have to be built from the bottom up rather than from the top down. And what is he talking about? Throughout history, these people have been trying to force a world government on society. It has not worked. The League of Nations after World War II, the United Nations, World War I, the United Nations after World War II, they did not work the way they were hoping they would work. And as a consequence, what they had to do is to start to work from the ground up. And they needed to create all of these myriad of organizations to do that. Continuing on with what he said, it will look like a great, booming, buzzing confusion. Isn't that the case? Everything is happening all around us. We have no idea where it's coming from, except it's all seem to be heading in the same direction. Amazing thing about that. It would look like a great, booming, buzzing confusion, to use William James' famous description of reality. But an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece, will accomplish much more than the old-fashioned frontal assault. So back in the early 1970s, they realized they had to take a multi-dimensional approach on this and begin to work at the international, national level across a broad spectrum of our societies. No aspect of our societies has gone untouched. Education, our judicial system, our political system, even our corporate system has been greatly, greatly, greatly impacted by this agenda. If we go back to Tragedy and Hope, written by Carroll Quigley back in 1966, we find this is what he's predicting for the future. This cartel expected that they would be able to control both parties equally. Indeed, some of them intended to contribute to both and allow an alternation between the two parties in public office in order to conceal their own influence, inhibit any exhibition of independence by politicians, and allow the electorate to believe that they were exercising their own free choice. Going on page 866, it is increasingly clear that in the 20th century, the expert will replace the industrial tycoon in control of the economic system, even as he will replace the democratic voter in control of the political system. This planning may not be single or unified, but it will be planning in which the main framework and the operational forces of the economic system will be established and limited by the experts on the governmental side, and then the experts on the economic side will do their planning within these established limitations. In other words, we have really no free choice in what we're doing, other than a few choices these experts or the cartel allow us to do. Going on, hopefully the elements of choice and freedom may survive for the ordinary individual in that he may be free to make a choice between two opposing political groups, even if these groups have little policy choice within the parameters of policy established by the experts. But in general, his freedom, our freedom, and choice will be controlled within very narrow alternatives. It's shocking to remember that he wrote this in 1966. Today we're seeing almost everything that he wrote being fulfilled before our very eyes. We have very limited options as to what we can do. If you're too young, you probably don't remember the type of freedom that was in existence back in 1966, 1970. Today, we don't have that. We're basically controlled by planners in everything that we do. Not only that, but our education is controlled, or at least heavily influenced. Our judicial system, our government, but all the way from the federal government all the way down to the local government. It's amazing. What Carroll quickly said was going to happen has happened. Let's go back to Daniel chapter 7 and verse 7 and 8. He says in verse 7, "After that, my vision at night I looked, and there before me was a fourth beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the other former beasts. It had 10 horns." And Daniel is describing, and it's also found in the book of Revelation, a confederacy of some sort of 10 nations or 10 kingdoms. Now, historically, we've looked at that as being the old European, or the old Europe, the 10 horns of the beast. For generations, what we found, and this was defined by the Club of Rome in the 1973 period, right at the time the Trilateral Commission was created, is that they envisioned a world, not just Europe, but a world divided up into 10 kingdoms. And I'm not going to go into any great detail right now. I'll come back to what has actually happened in a moment. But they actually saw the world would be divided up into 10 nations, or 10 kingdoms. What is actually happening now, it became very obvious in the International Conference for Financing for Development of the United Nations in Monterrey, Mexico in March of 2002. They came out with a policy of regionalizing the world. And that's beginning to happen now. The first one is the Free Trade Zones of America. You've been seeing that in the news the last several years. The second one, obviously, is the European Union. The third is the Russian Federation, which often joins with the European Union to try to spoil the Anglo-American faction. The fourth is ASEAN, where China is dominant within the Southeastern Asian area. The fifth is going to be in the South Pacific. It hasn't really been that far along yet, but you're seeing Australia taking a greater and greater role into the political situations and activities of the South Pacific. The sixth is the Arab League, or what will derive out of the Arab League. It looks like it's going to be changing its name into something else here in the next year or so we'll have to wait and see. But that is the sixth one. The seventh one is the African Union. The African Union came into existence when I was in South Africa in 2002 attending the World Summit on Sustainable Development. It is a process that I don't think will finally reach fruition. I think it's going to be divided into two. Just like I think the free trade zones of the Americas will not survive as one single entity, but will actually divide into two. When that happens, what we will have is 9 different regions, financial or economic regions in the world. That still leaves out Japan. And it could be that Japan South Korea, and perhaps even Taiwan, which has a huge economic effect on the world, will form its own union between the three nations. I don't know. Nothing's really been said about it yet, but that if it does, it'll be the 10th. Interesting, isn't it? That we're seeing this happen in our lives right now. Now, you could say very easily, well, yeah, but we used to think the European Union was going to be the 10-nation confederacy, and it's turned out that there's now 20 some odd nations in that. Wouldn't that happen within the world? Yes, it may. It could be that this is totally wrong. But God said through Jesus Christ, be aware and know when these things begin to happen. And they're happening. Interestingly, I've always said that the North and South Americas will probably divide up into two entities. And it wasn't until 2005 that became an obvious reality with the announcement that there's going to be a North American Union between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. It is astonishing how this is coming to fruition. They're going to have a superhighway without any borders, without any check stops, from central Mexico all the way up into Canada, through the United States, and throughout Canada. There's going to be also some lateral highways that snake off into this to serve the various states. But the fact is that we have a major highway that will not have any customs except perhaps in either Kansas or St. Louis. And these trucks from Mexico or Canada can cross our international boundary without one check occurring. Our borders become liquid, allowing any terrorist with any kind of equipment to be able to freely enter the United States, and they will not be checked. And of course, they can drop off their load anywhere. Even though there's supposed to be safeguards, they won't occur. It's called the Security and Prosperity Partnership of North America, or SPP for short. You're going to hear more and more about that over the next several years. Right now, very, very few people are even aware that it exists. When it's time, the SPP, or the North American Union, will be actually in physical place before President Bush takes it to the Senate for ratification using his fast track option, which only allows 20 hours of debate. Think of that. Something that would radically change the sovereignty and the life of the people of the United States is only going to be allowed 20 hours of debate. It's going to be an incredible thing. And of course, there's no one that can voice any concerns and so forth in 20 hours. Either it'll pass or it will fail. And tremendous political leverage will be used to advance this agenda, to advance this treaty when it's finally brought before the U.S. Senate for ratification. You will be ignored. In fact, you'll be ignored just like you're being ignored right now. As they're developing this thing, nobody knows about it. There's no discussion going on. Although the conservative media has been trying to expose this agenda, the mainstream media has been totally silent on this particular issue, except for CNN and Lou Dobbs.
The Bush administration's open borders policy and its decision to ignore the enforcement of this country's immigration laws is part of a broader agenda. President Bush signed a formal agreement that will end the United States as we know it, and he took the step without approval from either the U.S. Congress or the people of the United States. Bill Tucker reports.
The Security and Prosperity Partnership of North America sounds benign, hardly like a policy that critics call NAFTA on steroids. It's a deal that few have even heard of.
It's being done again by very few people at the very top on behalf of the investment class, but the working class of people. Political officials across our country, from communities, from cities and so forth, they don't know anything about this.
Yet it was agreed to by Mexico's President Fox, Canada's Prime Minister Martin, and President Bush in 2005. Administration officials counter their critics by saying everything about SPP is on the White House website. And they say the partnership is not a treaty, but more of an outline of priorities between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Still, some wonder why there haven't been public discussions about the goals being pursued.
This SPP includes, for instance, a committee that is sitting down to harmonize our meat inspection, and food safety. So how far away from a trade agreement can your dining room table and what you feed your kids be?
Other parts of the agreement mention border security as an issue, which include all of North America. In fact, the name of the agreement is not Security and Prosperity of the United States, but of North America.
When we elect officials, we expect them to act on our behalf. When we get involved in cooperative frameworks with other countries for joint regulation of fisheries or rail transportation or the skies, we're basically sharing our sovereignty with that government and outsourcing some of what we give our elected officials.
As disturbing as some find SPP, there is legislation in the House introduced by Florida's Katherine Harris that closely resembles the goals of the partnership. Included in that bill is a section which calls for the securing of Mexico's southern border by the United States and Canada. Lou, that's not the border with the United States, that's the border they share with Belize and Guatemala.
The idea that the White House would respond that this is on their website, this involves intricate workings amongst the Commerce Department of this country and Canada and Mexico's, of course. A regional prosperity and security program. This is absolute ignorance. And the fact that we reported this, we should point out, when it was signed. But as we watch this thing progress, these working groups are continuing, they're intensifying. What in the world are these people thinking about?
Well, they say, look, these are a declaration and an outline of our priorities. And when I called them today, Lou, they said I was the first phone call they had received literally since the deal was first signed. So people are not paying attention, and they're letting them, in fact, get away with this.
You know, I was asked the other day about whether or not I really thought the American people had the stomach to stand up and stop this nonsense, this direction from a group of elites in absolute contravention of our law, of our Constitution, every national value. And I hope, I pray that I'm right when I said yes. But this is beyond belief. Bill Tucker, very much.
So what we're seeing in what Lou Dobbs had said is an elite group, which is true, that is trying to basically break down our sovereignty into something that we do not have any control over. We basically give our control over to this multinational agreement. It's going to be one in which we have almost a European Union-like arrangement between Canada, United States, and Mexico. In fact, it is tailored. They will deny that it is, but their long-term goals strongly suggest that they wanted to create a European Union type of an arrangement for those three nations, just like they're doing with the Russian Federation, ASEAN, South America right now is forming their own. All of these different Asian economic regions are actually using the European Union pattern to bring about what they want to do in this 10-nation confederacy. I'd like to shift gears now and go to Revelation chapter 13 and look at exactly what is going to happen in regards to the so-called mark of the beast. And going to Revelation 13, verses 1 through 4, he says, "And the dragon stood on the shore of the sea." If you went back to chapter 12, you would find that he's talking about the dragon, and therefore he's continuing on with this right now. And he says, "And I saw a beast coming out of the sea. He had 10 horns and 7 heads with 10 crowns on his horns, and on each head a blasphemous name." There's the 10 horns again that we saw in Daniel, and along with the 10 toes. Now there's also 7 heads. There's a story behind that. I'm not going to get into it. I just don't have time right now. The dragon gave the beast his power and the throne and great authority. So the dragon, or Satan, is going to be giving what we call the Antichrist great authority and the throne to rule over all the nations. In verse 3, one of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was astonished and followed the beast. Men worshipped the dragon because he had given the authority to the beast. And they also worshipped the beast and asked, "Who is like the beast? Who can make war against him?" What we're going to see here is a very, very powerful, just like Daniel said, it's going to crush anything and devour anything that gets in its way. And as a consequence, we need to recognize that it's going to be almost impossible, or it's going to seem like it's impossible for anybody to prevail against this beast. In fact, it will be impossible, because other prophecy says that all the Christians of the world at that time are not going to be able to stand up against Satan as he rules in these final 3.5 years. In verse 11, then I saw another beast coming out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. He exercised all the authority of the first beast on his behalf, and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound has been healed. In verse 13, and he performed great and miraculous signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven into full view of men. Because of the signs he was given power to do on behalf of the first beast, he deceived the inhabitants of the earth, and he ordered them to set up the image of honor in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. So this second beast is also called the false prophet, and he's going to have the ability to do incredible miracles, or what seem to be miracles. It will be like somebody from the Stone Age seeing our television, our airplanes, our automobiles, you name it, our modern technology. To him, it would seem like miracles, but in fact, we know it nothing but technology. I don't know if these will be true miracles or if it will be just nothing more than advanced technology that we're not aware of. Regardless, it's going to be enough to even deceive the elect. So we need to be cautious and aware as Christians that whatever happens is going to be so amazing and so convincing that we could easily be deceived. And if we have not been in the Bible, if we've not been studying the Bible, if we're not grounded in the Bible and prophecy, we potentially could be deceived. And remember Matthew from, I think, about 9 to 14, talks about the fact there's going to be a great falling away of Christians when this happens. They're going to be deceived. They're going to want to follow after the beast because he's going to be promising wonderful things. In fact, just like in the days of Nimrod, they're going to be promised that they can become like God. Now, who else would not want to follow them? Who else would not want to become a god? And many of the Christians that are not grounded are going to be deceived. Be warned. In verse 14, because of the signs he was given power to do on behalf of the first beast, he deceived the inhabitants of the earth. Most everyone is going to, by the middle of tribulation, is going to believe in whatever they're trying to sell because of all these miracles. He ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. This is called the abomination that causes desolation, mentioned by Jesus in Matthew, as well as Daniel 9:27 and other places. It's going to happen. When it happens, I don't know. It's still years ahead of us, or at least I think it's years ahead of us. But nonetheless, when it does, it's going to cause tremendous havoc. Going on in Revelation 13:15, he said he was given power to breathe life into the image of the first beast so that it could speak and cause all who refuse to worship the image to be killed. If you do not worship that image of the first beast, you're going to die. Simple as that. And as a consequence, many people are going to bow down their knee to him. In verse 16, he also forced everyone, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or on his forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. Now, interestingly, for centuries, scholars have tried to figure out what this could possibly be, because in verse 18 he says, this calls for wisdom. If anyone has insight, let him calculate the number of the beast, for it is man's number. His number is 666. The mark of the beast, the infamous 666 that so many people are afraid of. Did you know that it's a real thing? For centuries, as I mentioned, scholars have been trying to figure out what this could mean. They've been trying to ascribe it to different men who, if you turn the alphabetic and numbers, can add up to 666. Henry Kissinger, for instance, his name, if you add it up in the Hebrew, is 666. I really don't think that has a whole lot of water. There may be something to it, but I don't think that's the main thing that John was saying right here as this was revealed to him by God. There is, however, a 666. And Alice Bailey, in her book, The Rays of Initiations, on page 79, and remember, to all call, her ascended master was supposed to have written this through her. She was just automatically writing. She says, to this bright sinner we give the name Shambhala, the component letters of which are numerically S, H, A, M, B, A, or 1.8.1.4.2.1.3.3.1. And it has both a name and a number, exactly as John has told us in Revelation 13. This word equals the number 24, which in turn equals 6. I would call your attention to the fact that the word has in it 9 letters, and as you know, 9 is the number of initiation. The goal of all initiatory process is to admit mankind into the realization of and the identification with the will or purpose of deity. In other words, she is describing, and she does this much more plainly elsewhere, that man will become as God. The same lie Satan told Eve in the Garden of Eden. The same lie that Nimrod believed in is now being manifest today. Again, 6 being the number of the 6th ray, it is therefore the number of idealism and of that driving force which makes mankind move forward upon the path and in response to the vision and the press upward towards the light. And who's the light? Satan. And Satan will be on planet Earth in the last 3.5 years of the tribulation. So all of this is culminating together. The 666 is the realization of godhood for mankind. Now, she goes on, page 79 and 80, like all other divine qualities, it has a material counterpart, and that is why 666 is regarded as the number of the beast, or materialism, the number of the dominance of the 3 worlds prior to the process of reorientation and the expression of the developed idealism and purpose. The third aspect expresses itself through pure materialism and is hence the 3 sixes. So she explains away the biblical 366 as just being materialism. Of course, if you remember the first 3.5 years, or much of the first 3.5 years, it's going to be very, very at peace, very prosperous and so forth, and very materialistic. But nonetheless, she explains away the prophetic 666 and makes it into something very positive. Now, if you don't think this is reflecting itself in geopolitics, remember this. Back in 1992, the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro was a culminating effort of decades worth of work to initiate this environmental ethic or this environmental religion into society. Maurice Strong, one of the co-authors of the Earth Charter, was the Secretary General of the Earth Summit in 1992. And he said this upon making his initiatory comments. This is the great invocation which is also found in Rays of Initiations on the prefix of page 7. From the point of light within the mind of God, let light stream forward into the minds of men. Let light descend on earth. From the point of love within the heart of God, let love stream forth into the hearts of men. May Christ return to the earth. Now, when he says that Christ should be returning to the earth, it's not Jesus Christ. It's the avatar Christ. It's the avatar peace. This is what they're striving for. It has nothing to do with the Savior, Jesus Christ. Going on, from the center where the will of God is known, let purpose guide the little wills of men, the purpose which the masters know and serve. The ascended masters, these spirit masters. Christians would today call them demons. From the center which we call the race of men, let the plan of love and light, Satan's plan, which is also light, work out, and may it seal the door where evil dwells. And this is the key. Let light and love and power restore the plan on earth. The plan is to basically bring mankind into godhood. That's what they intend to do. This is what they believe in. That's what they have been told by their ascended masters in the spirit world. And it was the guiding principle of the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, and ever since that time. Now, at the same time, in 1972, when the Trilateral Commission was being formed by Zbigniew Brzezinski, as well as David Rockefeller, Brzezinski said this. He is the former National Security Advisor to President Carter, so he had a very powerful position. He says that at the same time, the capacity to assert social and political control over the individual will vastly increase. It will soon be possible to assert almost continuous control over every citizen and to maintain up-to-date files containing even the most personal details about health and personal behavior of every citizen, in addition to the more customary data. These files will be subject to instantaneous retrieval by the authorities. Power will gravitate into the hands of those who control this information. And I don't think there's any doubt in anyone's mind that more and more information is now being developed about you and I, and is accessible, although somewhat difficult, by our government or under nefarious individuals. We are losing our identity as individuals and merging into the global whole. But it gets worse. Many people believe that the 666 is the uniform product code that you found on every single product that you buy at the supermarket or anywhere else. And the reason why they say that, if you look at any product code, any item, it starts, and in the middle there is, and at the end there is the symbol for 6. There's two little narrow bars, both at either end and right smack in the middle. It's for orientation of any scanner so they can read it upside down or whatever the case might be. This is not going to be the symbol of the Antichrist. However, the technology is not too far from what is coming in that regard. What I believe is happening right now to build this case for the mark of the beast is the development of these chips that can be inserted. They're not much bigger than a grain of rice and can be inserted under your skin with a large hypodermic needle. They're almost painless to do so. These are inserted usually right now in the right arm, but at the same time, there's a lot of technology or a lot of work being done to put them on your hand. So all you have to do is wave your hand over a scanner, much like what you see with the universal product code. So there is a relationship, but it's not the code itself. You don't have to be afraid about buying products and so forth. But this is very dangerous. It's always put into context with something very, very positive. Protecting your children from, if they wander away, you can find them instantaneously. Your pets, it's already being used for pets. It's already being used now, as we'll see in a moment, for hospital identification so they can have access to your records. They can do anything instantaneously once this is in place, just like Zbigniew Brzezinski said back in 1973. It's becoming a reality today as we speak. What I would like to do now is to take a look at a video clip.
On a typical day, patients come in with heart attacks, strokes, major trauma, with cancer patients and septic shock. You name it, we have it.
What might improve the odds for some of those patients at New Jersey's Hackensack University Medical Center is this. That tiny chip Dr. Joseph Feldman, head of the hospital's trauma unit, holds in his hand. It's a radio frequency identification, or RFID tag.
It sounds like science fiction, but Nick Minicucci is getting a microchip implanted in his arm.
I didn't feel it at all, actually. When you pulled it out, that's the only time I felt it actually leaving.
The chip is smaller than a thumbnail, but allows doctors access to his entire medical records.
How does it work? With the wave of a wand, the doctor reads a unique ID number, then logs onto a central database to quickly access your medical history, surgical history, any medications you take, your allergies and blood type, even an emergency contact.
It's the sickest patients that you need accurate information, medical information, up front in a very timely fashion.
He assures patients that their confidential records can only be viewed by proper medical personnel.
When you think of written medical records, how secure really are they?
But these microchips are at the center of a serious debate about fundamental privacy rights. The Electronic Privacy Information Center's Mark Rottenberg is concerned that there currently are no rules that regulate or limit how this chip can be used.
To suggest that somehow this is not personal information is simply misleading. It is
a passive scanner that awakens our proprietary chip. It is not an active RFID tag that they have in retail environments where the technology is used for the benefit of the retailer. This is used for the benefit of a patient, a high-risk patient, being brought into an emergency. What you see you getting here is a 16-digit identifier, and the database information is really where the medical records are stored, and you as the patient have control over that database. You allow what group of affiliates, such as emergency rooms, that you want to have access to that database. So control is at the root of privacy.
What we're seeing right now is this unique effort to create a system where anybody can be scanned and they're identified and have access to all of their personal information within a moment. It's that fast. It can be read by satellites. It's not being done right now They're building on the basis of using these little wands and so forth, but they can be used with satellites. As we're seeing in this diagram right here, digital angel, which is one of these components, can actually transmit by using the electrical balance in your own body these symbols up to a satellite, and they can track you at any time, anywhere you are. It's the perfect system to be able to control what you buy and sell. It's being done for a very good reason. Identity theft, for once. You lose your credit card and all of a sudden you have huge charges built up. All of these things would be supposedly eliminated with this kind of a chip. And so as a consequence, what we're seeing is a huge effort that will eventually come into what I believe is the mark of the beast. Now, all kinds of security precautions are now in place. It can be used for very positive things. In fact, I think most of our military either carry a card or are already injected in one of these, where if they're captured, they can be found immediately. But the fact is, even with these safety precautions can be immediately withdrawn with a corrupt government. A corrupt government dominated by the Antichrist or even Satan himself. It's just a matter of time when this actually happens. If you don't think this is happening, just listen to what President Clinton said back in 1977 when he was addressing the United Nations. He said, "The forces of global integration are a great tide, inexorably wearing away the established order of things. People are susceptible to misguided protectionism, to the poisoned appeals of extreme nationalism, and ethnic, racial, and religious hatred. New global environmental challenges require us to find ways of working together." So again, environmental issues are used basically as a surrogate issue to make this happen. Continuing on, we need a new strategy of security. Over the past 5 years, nations have begun to put that strategy into place through a new network of institutions and arrangements. Through this web of institutions and arrangements, nations are now setting the international ground rules for the 21st century, laying a foundation for security and prosperity for those who live within them, while isolating those who challenge them from the outside. He basically said what John said in Revelation chapter 13. In order to operate, in order to be a citizen of the world, you'll have to have this implanted in you and be obedient to these institutions that they're developing right now. It's happening. It's not too far away. How far? Again, I don't know. But there is hope. There's always hope. Let's go back to Daniel chapter 2 again. I found many places in the Bible, but let's just look at this one set of verses. In that chapter 2, verses 34. "While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were broken into pieces at the same time and became like chaff on the threshing floor. A mountain filled the whole earth." In other words, there will come a time when God will destroy this new nation. This will be called Armageddon. It will happen. And all of Satan's efforts to defeat the world, to defeat Christians, to defeat the Jews, will be for no avail. Continuing on in verse 44, "In the time of those kings, God of heaven will send up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it itself will endure. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of the mountain, but not by human hands. A rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, the gold to pieces." God will do this, and this we can have hope. But God warns us many times in the book of Revelation that if you happen to be there, the rapture aside, but if you happen to be going through this time, stand firm. Even though you know you will probably be killed during this period, stand firm, because salvation is near, and God will prevail, and you will have eternal life. That's the promise that God has given us. It's the promise that we have to hold on as times get rough, because they will get much more difficult, especially for Christians. Thank you, and good night.